The vote hit 4,012 to 1 before I stopped counting. I stood in the center of the conclave amphitheater on Thesson Prime, surrounded by holographic tallies climbing in columns of cold blue light, and watched every species in the known galaxy agree on a single thing for the first time in recorded history. They agreed that Earth had to go. Not defeated, not conquered, not punished, banished, erased from every ledger, every corridor, every treaty. The word they used was quarantine, as if humanity were a disease that needed containment, and the chamber roared with 4,000 voices saying yes. I am Nathan Cole. I was the last human attaché to the Galactic Governing Conclave, which meant I had a fancy title, a small office on a station that smelled like copper, and exactly 8 people on my team, 9 of us total, standing in a chamber built for species that had been sailing between stars when humans were still arguing about whether the Earth was flat. 9 humans against 4,000 civilizations, and not one of those civilizations raised a single vote in our defense. Lucy Barrow stood to my left. She was my senior aide, and she had been holding the same datapad for 11 minutes without blinking. Peter Hale was behind me, arms crossed, jaw locked tight enough to crack teeth. Catherine Webb had her eyes closed. The rest of my team lined up like soldiers at a funeral, which was fitting because that is exactly what this was. The Vathori speaker, a tall figure named Kethran, with skin like polished granite and 6 eyes arranged in a crescent across his forehead, raised one elongated hand, and the chamber fell silent. Kethran had a voice like stones grinding together, deep and slow, and utterly certain of itself. He read the charges first. Cultural contamination, mimetic destabilization, unregulated philosophical proliferation. The words meant nothing individually, but strung together they painted a picture of a species so dangerous that its stories, its music, its questions, its way of looking at the universe had begun infecting other civilizations like a virus. The truth was simpler than that. Humans asked questions that the ruling species could not answer, and that terrified them more than any weapon ever could. A Tessari colony had adopted human democratic models and overthrown its hereditary leadership in a single generation. A Dranathi trade guild had started publishing human economic theory and watching its profits double while the union-approved economic framework kept their competitors stagnant. An Ilvari university had begun teaching human philosophy alongside their own, and their students had started asking questions that their professors could not answer, and their government did not want asked. We had not invaded anyone. We had not threatened anyone. We had simply existed loudly, in a galaxy that preferred its younger species to exist quietly, and the galaxy had decided that our volume was a threat to its silence. I had spent 14 years in diplomatic service across 6 galactic sectors. I had negotiated trade agreements with the Dranathi, who could smell dishonesty in your sweat. I had brokered peace between the Ilvari and the Tessari during their border dispute, sitting in a room that was half vacuum and half toxic atmosphere, because neither species breathed the same air. I had stood in front of species that could kill me with a thought, and spoken without trembling. But standing in that amphitheater, watching the tally climb, I felt something I had not felt since I was a child, watching storm clouds roll toward my house. Helplessness. The absolute certainty that nothing I said or did would change what was coming. Kethran read the banishment terms in that grinding voice. Earth was stripped of all trade licenses effective immediately. Every FTL corridor linking our system to galactic space would be sealed. All diplomatic standing was revoked. Every human living off-world had 90 standard solar days to return to Earth or face arrest and indefinite detention. All human-built infrastructure on alien worlds, every station, every outpost, every research facility we had spent decades constructing, became Union property without compensation. Our star system was declared a permanent quarantine zone, and any vessel entering or leaving would be destroyed without warning. He read each term slowly, deliberately, making certain that every delegation heard every word. The chamber was so quiet between each sentence that I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. 4,000 species. Not one objection. The Rethan delegation, an agricultural bloc we had helped through 3 famines, sat motionless. The Dranathi, who had grown wealthy trading human goods, examined their instruments without looking up. The Ilvari, whose chief scientist owed her career to a breakthrough built on human research, stared straight ahead with an expression of studied neutrality. Species we had saved, species we had helped, species we had traded with and laughed with, and built partnerships over decades of patient diplomacy. Every single one of them sat in their seats and said nothing as our existence was voted away. That silence taught me something about the galaxy that 14 years of diplomatic service had not. Gratitude is a currency that expires the moment it becomes expensive to hold. Kethran turned those 6 eyes toward me and asked if humanity had a final statement. The chamber grew so quiet, I could hear the hum of the atmospheric processors embedded in the walls. Lucy reached into her bag and held out a thin data chip. I knew what was on it. We had spent 4 months drafting a diplomatic response, carefully worded and legally precise, designed to preserve whatever thread of connection we could maintain. 4 months of careful language meant to keep a door open, even if only a crack. Legal arguments citing precedent, emotional appeals to shared history, practical proposals for modified membership. I took the chip from Lucy and put it in my jacket pocket without looking at it. I walked to the podium. The amphitheater stretched out before me, in concentric rings rising toward a ceiling I could not see, filled with delegates from species whose names I could not pronounce, and whose biology I could barely comprehend. Some breathed methane. Some communicated through bioluminescent pulses. Some were so old that their civilizations had risen and fallen, and risen again before Earth's sun had finished forming. Every one of them had just voted to erase us. I leaned into the podium and said 5 words. We will remember this. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. The first silence had been anticipation. This one was something colder. I could feel it settle across the chamber like frost on glass. Kethran's 6 eyes narrowed. Several delegates shifted in their seats. A Drenathi merchant in the 3rd ring let out a low whistle that I had learned, over years of diplomatic service, was their equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. A cluster of Tessari delegates exchanged rapid bioluminescent flickers, too fast for the translation systems to capture, which meant they were nervous. I did not elaborate. I did not explain. I turned and walked back to my team and said, "We are leaving." Peter fell into step beside me as we exited the chamber. "That was not the prepared statement," he said quietly. "No," I agreed, "it was not." "What was it?" I did not answer because I did not yet have the words for what it was. A promise, a warning. The sound of a door closing that would never open the same way again. All of those things, and none of them. What I knew, in the marrow of my bones, was that the prepared statement was written for a world where we were still asking for a seat at the table. That world had ended the moment the vote passed. We were not asking for anything anymore. We took the transport back to Earth in near silence. The journey through the FTL corridor felt different this time, knowing it was one of the last times any human vessel would be permitted passage. The corridor walls shifted in colors that human eyes could barely process, ripples of ultraviolet and deep infrared that our instruments translated into something we could see. Beautiful. In the way that a cage can be beautiful when you do not yet know it is closing. Lucy cried. She did it silently, turned toward the viewport, and I pretended not to notice because she would have wanted it that way. Peter paced the length of the transport 3 times before sitting down and staring at the floor with his fists clenched on his knees. Catherine opened her eyes for the first time since the vote and said, "They made a mistake." I did not respond immediately. Instead, I opened my personal terminal and began writing. The document I started was not a protest, not an appeal, not a letter to any government or council or authority. It was a list. Every rule the Galactic Union had ever written. Every regulation, every statute, every protocol, every trade restriction, every corridor control measure, every weapons classification, every territorial boundary, every economic framework, all of it. 1.7 million statutes governing the behavior of 4,000 species across a galaxy that had been organized, codified, and controlled for longer than human civilization had existed. The title of the document was simple: Every Rule They Ever Made, and How Each One Breaks. Catherine looked over my shoulder, read the title, and for the first time in 6 hours, she smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of someone who understood that the game had changed, and that we were no longer playing by anyone else's terms. Earth received us like a mother receiving children who had been thrown out of school. The FTL corridor sealed behind our transport with a sound like a thunderclap, and just like that we were cut off, quarantined, alone. The news spread across the planet within minutes, and I expected panic. I expected protests, fear, anger, all the things that civilizations are supposed to feel when they are cast out. Instead, something else happened. Something I had not anticipated but should have, because I had spent my entire career studying what made humanity different from every other species in the galaxy. People got to work. Within 72 hours, I was sitting in a bunker beneath the Atacama Desert, across a table from George Palmer, the four-star general who commanded Earth's strategic operations, and Helen Cross, who had run our intelligence networks across 6 alien sectors before the banishment. George had a map of the solar system projected above the table, marked with 14 points of light that I did not recognize. "Hidden orbital yards," George said, before I could ask. "We have been building for 11 years. I stared at the map. 14 points of light scattered across the solar system, tucked behind moons, embedded in asteroid fields, hidden in the radiation shadows of gas giants where sensor scans could not penetrate. 11 years of construction without a single alien intelligence service detecting a thing." "Building what?" I asked. Helen leaned forward. "Everything." That night, alone in my quarters deep beneath the desert, I pulled the data chip from my jacket pocket. The diplomatic response I had never delivered. I turned it over in my fingers for a long time, feeling the smooth edges, thinking about the months of work that had gone into its contents. Then I put it in a drawer without reading it, and closed the drawer, and sat on the edge of my bed in the dark. The time for diplomacy was finished. They had written the rules that governed the galaxy, and they had used those rules to throw us out. There was only one logical response, and every human being on Earth already understood it, even if they could not yet articulate it. If the rules said we did not exist, then the rules had to stop existing too. 6 months after the banishment, the galaxy forgot about us. That was the first gift they gave us, though they did not know it. Every alien news network ran the same story with minor variations. Earth was dying, humanity was collapsing without access to galactic trade. The quarantine was working. The threat was contained. Some networks ran estimates of how long human civilization could survive in isolation. The most generous gave us 30 years. The least generous gave us 5. One Vathori commentator compared us to an insect sealed in amber, preserved but irrelevant, a curiosity that future species would study to understand what happens when a civilization punches above its weight and gets knocked back down. I watched these broadcasts from a command center, buried 200 meters beneath the Chilean desert, surrounded by screens that showed me things those news networks would never report. 14 orbital construction yards operating around the clock, their assembly lines turning out vessels that did not appear on any registry. A fleet of 230 stealth-capable ships, each one smaller than a standard Vathori patrol craft, but faster than anything the Union had ever tracked on its sensors. A quantum communication array that operated on frequencies the Union did not know existed, linking our ships across galactic distances without a single detectable signal. And a team of 1,100 analysts working through the Galactic Regulatory Code, line by line, statute by statute, looking for every load-bearing wall in the structure. I ran the Off-Grid Operations Directorate, which was a deliberately boring name for a department whose sole purpose was to dismantle the galactic order from the outside. My core team had grown beyond the original 8. Lucy Barrow managed logistics, turning our hidden fleet into a supply network that could move goods across quarantine lines without detection. She had a gift for invisible organization, making complex operations look simple, by ensuring that every piece was in the right place before anyone asked for it. Peter Hale ran intelligence, maintaining contact with sympathetic alien operatives who fed us information about Union fleet movements, political developments, and internal disputes. He never slept more than 4 hours and never missed a signal. Catherine Webb was the architect, the person who understood the regulatory code better than the species who had written it. Catherine was the one who found the fractures. 340, Catherine said one morning, dropping a tablet on my desk with a sound that was louder than it needed to be, which was her way of telling me this was important. I picked it up and scrolled through a list of statute numbers, each one annotated with a chain of dependencies that branched outward like roots from a tree. 340 what? Critical structural dependencies. Rules that support other rules that support other rules. Remove them, and the system does not just slow down. It does not just inconvenience someone. It breaks. Completely. Irreversibly. She sat across from me and folded her hands on the desk. The union is not a government, Nathan. It is a machine. Every rule is a bolt, holding the machine together. Most bolts are redundant. You can remove them, and the machine keeps running. But 340 of them are not redundant. They are load-bearing. Remove the right ones, in the right order, at the right time, and the machine tears itself apart under its own weight. I studied the list for 3 days. I brought in Philip Drake, our chief engineer, to verify the structural analysis. I had Laura Kent, who ran communications, cross-reference the dependencies against real-time intelligence from Peter's network. Everything checked out. Catherine was right. The union's regulatory structure was not designed for resilience. It was designed for control. Every trade restriction supported a tariff structure that funded the enforcement fleets that maintained the trade restrictions. Every corridor control fed data to a logistics network that determined resource allocation, that determined which species received what and when. It was circular, self-reinforcing, and built on the assumption that no one would ever challenge the entire system at once, because no one ever had. No one had ever been desperate enough. Until now. Edward Marsh commanded our stealth fleet. He was a former naval officer who had been recalled to Earth 2 weeks before the banishment vote, when intelligence suggested what was coming. Edward had gray hair cut close to his scalp, hands that never shook, and a way of looking at tactical problems that reminded me of a chess player who could see 12 moves ahead. He was methodical, precise, and completely humorless, which made him perfect for the kind of work we needed. He ran insertion missions through the quarantine perimeter, using gravitational blind spots, gaps in the Union's sensor coverage, caused by the mass shadows of planets and asteroids that their automated systems could not fully account for. The perimeter is a fence, Edward told me during one of our briefings, pointing to a 3-dimensional projection of the solar system's edge where the quarantine sensors formed a shell around us. Not a wall. Fences have gaps. Their sensors are calibrated for large signature vessels, standard drive emissions, conventional hull profiles. Our ships are small, our drives are quiet, and our hulls are coated in material that absorbs rather than reflects sensor pulses. We can slip through the gaps like water through a sieve. He demonstrated during our first major insertion, personally commanding a 3-ship squadron through a gravity shadow behind Jupiter's outermost moon. The Union had placed a sensor buoy there, but it was designed to detect vessels the size of frigates or larger. Our ships were barely bigger than civilian shuttles, running drives that Edward's engineers had muffled to emit signatures indistinguishable from natural radiation. The squadron passed within 600 kilometers of the buoy. The buoy registered nothing. Edward brought his ships back, ran the same route 4 more times with different approach angles, and confirmed that the gap was reliable. Within a week, he had identified 19 similar gaps in the quarantine perimeter. Within a month, our ships were moving through all of them on regular schedules. Through those gaps, our ships began doing 3 things. First, they broadcast. Human music, human literature, human philosophy, human comedy, human drama, human everything. Transmitted on frequencies the Union's communication filters could not block because the Union did not know those frequencies existed. The Conclave had banished us because our culture was spreading too fast. Now, with nothing left to lose, we flooded the airwaves. Let them try to contain a signal they could not find. Second, we traded, not through official channels, because we had none, through back doors, private arrangements, handshake deals with merchant captains from species who did not care about politics and cared very much about profit. The Drenathi were first. They had always been traders above all else, and the banishment had cut off their access to human goods that their customers wanted desperately. A Drenathi captain named Vareth made contact through one of Peter's intelligence channels and arranged the first exchange in the debris field of an abandoned mining operation 3 systems from the quarantine boundary. Human medical compounds for Dranathi navigation data. Simple, quiet, mutually beneficial. The handshake, metaphorical since Dranathi did not have hands in the human sense, lasted exactly 4 seconds. The partnership that followed would last years. Third, we mapped every FTL corridor choke point, every patrol route, every sensor gap, every communication relay, every supply depot, every maintenance schedule for every piece of infrastructure the Union operated. We built a 3-dimensional model of the Union's entire operational architecture, so detailed that Catherine said it was better than anything the Union itself possessed. We knew where their ships were before their own commanders did. We knew when their sensors cycled through maintenance windows. We knew which corridors carried military traffic and which carried commercial goods, and exactly what time each day the traffic patterns shifted. None of this was violent. All of it was illegal. And every single day it continued. Earth grew stronger, while the galaxy believed we were dying. Laura Kent was the one who intercepted the message that changed the tone of everything we were doing. She burst into my office at 3 in the morning, holding a decrypted transmission printout, her hair disheveled, and her eyes bright with the particular intensity that meant she had found something significant. A Dranathi freighter captain, not Vareth, but someone in his network, had sent a coded burst transmission directly to our quantum array. The message was short. You do not understand what you have done. They made you forbidden. Every species in the galaxy wants what it cannot have. Demand for human goods has increased 300% since the ban. We cannot move product fast enough. Every port we visit, someone asks if we have human merchandise. Not openly, in whispers, in back rooms, behind closed doors. You have become the most sought-after commodity in the galaxy, not despite the quarantine but because of it. I read the message twice. Then I read it a 3rd time. Then I called Catherine and Edward and Lucy and Peter into my office and read it aloud. Lucy laughed. It was the first real laugh I had heard from her since the conclave vote, and the sound of it in that underground bunker felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. They turned us into contraband. Better than contraband, Catherine said, and there was that smile again, the one that meant she was already thinking 6 moves ahead. They turned us into the most valuable thing in the galaxy, the thing nobody is allowed to have. Philip Drake, who had been building our independent FTL network for 7 years in secret, came to me 3 weeks later with a proposal that made my stomach drop. He wanted to go live, not a test. Not a partial activation. Full operational deployment of 47 FTL routes that did not use Union corridors, that punched through unregulated space, that connected systems the Union had kept deliberately isolated from each other for centuries. Philip was not a man given to dramatic gestures. He was an engineer in the purest sense, someone who believed that problems existed to be solved and that solutions should be elegant, efficient, and reliable. He had spent 7 years building drive systems in hidden labs, testing them in the empty spaces between stars where no one was watching, refining the technology until it was not just functional, but superior to anything the Union operated. Their FTL corridors were like highways, fixed paths through folded space that had been carved out millennia ago and maintained by massive infrastructure stations. Our system did not need corridors. Our drives folded space independently, creating temporary pathways that existed only for the duration of transit and left no trace behind. If we turn it on, Philip said, his engineer's hands steady even as his voice carried the weight of what he was proposing, they will know we have it. There is no taking that back. How many routes? 47 confirmed. Another 30 under development. Everyone bypasses Union checkpoints completely. Species that have been paying corridor access fees their entire existence will suddenly have a free alternative. I looked at the map he projected across my office wall. The routes spread across the galaxy like cracks in glass, a web of pathways that existed entirely outside the Union's control. I studied it for a long time. Not yet, I told Philip, but soon. When we light the match, we light all of them at once. 14 months after the banishment, I gave the order. We called it Operation Kindling, which was Catherine's idea because she said that when you burn a rulebook, you need kindling first. The operation was designed to hit 340 regulatory pressure points simultaneously across Union space in a single coordinated day. Not with weapons, not with soldiers, not with threats or ultimatums or declarations of war. With the most dangerous thing humanity had ever produced. Alternatives. The planning had taken months. Every stealth vessel in our fleet had been assigned specific targets, specific cargo, specific delivery windows. Edward Marsh had run 43 simulations of the fleet deployment, adjusting timing and routing until the margin of error dropped below 1%. Catherine had briefed every ship captain on exactly which regulations their deliveries would violate, and exactly what cascading effect each violation would trigger in the Union's interdependent regulatory structure. Philip had stress-tested the independent FTL network under full operational load and confirmed it could handle the traffic without degradation. Lucy had stockpiled enough cargo to supply 200 systems for 6 months, warehoused in orbital facilities hidden in the asteroid belt where the quarantine sensors could not reach. I spent the night before kindling walking the corridors of the Atacama facility alone. The bunker was never truly quiet. There were always systems humming, analysts working, communication arrays receiving. But at 3 in the morning, the human noise died down, and the mechanical noise was all that remained. I walked past the strategy room where Catherine's annotated regulatory code covered every wall, past the Fleet Command Center, where Edward's tactical displays cycled through patrol routes we had mapped across the galaxy, past the engineering lab, where Philip's FTL drive prototypes sat in testing cradles like sleeping weapons. I thought about what we were about to do. Not whether it was right, I had settled that question months ago, but whether it would work. Whether the fractures Catherine had identified would actually break under pressure, or whether the Union's system was more resilient than our models predicted. Whether the species receiving our deliveries would have the courage to use them, or whether fear of Union retaliation would keep them compliant. I thought about the 9 of us standing in the conclave chamber, about Lucy crying silently at the viewport, about Kethran's 6 eyes scanning me with the casual contempt of a being who believed we were already extinct. I thought about his words, "This will end with your destruction," and I thought about my response. No, it will not. The first wave launched at 0600 Coordinated Universal Time. 112 stealth vessels dropped out of our independent FTL network at predetermined points across 200 systems. Each vessel carried the same categories of cargo: medical technology that the Union classified as restricted, agricultural compounds that required licensing the Union had never granted to most species, energy generation blueprints that the Union had placed behind tariff walls so high that only the wealthiest civilizations could afford them, water purification systems, atmospheric processors, communication equipment, industrial fabrication templates. All of it human-designed, human-built, tested and refined in our hidden orbital yards. And all of it free. Not discounted, not subsidized. Free. Edward Marsh coordinated the fleet from the command center beneath the desert. I stood behind him and watched the operation unfold on a tactical display that covered an entire wall. Each vessel was a green dot, each target system a blue circle, and as the dots reached the circles and began transmitting, the display lit up like a constellation being born. First drop confirmed in the Rethagon agricultural sector, Laura reported from her station. Full download complete. They are distributing to secondary systems already. Second drop confirmed across the Ilvari border worlds. They are requesting additional medical packages. Third, fourth, fifth drops confirmed along the Dranathi trade corridor. Merchant fleets are redirecting to pick up cargo. Within 3 hours, 214 species had received direct deliveries of human technology that the Union had classified as restricted, regulated, or outright prohibited. Species that had been paying Union tariffs for basic medical supplies suddenly had access to compounds that were more effective and cost nothing. Agricultural blocks that had been locked into Union supply chains for centuries discovered that human food synthesis technology could feed their populations without a single credit changing hands. Energy grids that had been dependent on Union-controlled fuel sources received blueprints for reactors that ran on materials available in any asteroid field in any system. The economic model of the Galactic Union was built on dependency. Every species needed something that another species controlled, and the Union sat in the middle, taking its cut, adjusting the flow, deciding who received what and when and at what price. The Vaethori had designed it this way, deliberately over millennia, creating bottlenecks and control points that made the Union not just useful but essential. Need medicine? Apply for a distribution permit. Need energy? Register with the Resource Allocation Bureau. Need food? Submit a trade request and wait for approval. The bureaucracy was the point. Every form, every permit, every approval chain was a thread in a web designed to make independence impossible and obedience the only practical option. It was not evil in the way that a tyrant is evil. It was evil in the way that a monopoly is evil. Quietly, structurally, in the fine print that nobody reads until the price doubles and there is nowhere else to go. The species trapped inside the system did not even recognize it as a trap, because they had never known anything else. They paid their tariffs and filed their permits, and waited in their queues, because that was how the galaxy worked. And questioning how the galaxy worked was the kind of thinking that got species like humanity banished. We did not attack the monopoly. We made it unnecessary, and that was infinitely more dangerous. The second wave launched 4 hours after the first. Philip Drake activated the independent FTL network from his engineering station, his fingers moving across controls he had designed himself, with the calm precision of a man who had waited 7 years for this moment. He looked up at me once before initiating the sequence, a single glance that asked a question he already knew the answer to, and I nodded. He pressed the final control. All 47 confirmed routes went live simultaneously, punching through unregulated space and opening pathways that connected systems the Union had kept deliberately isolated. The activation was silent from our end, a series of green indicators replacing amber ones across Philip's console, but across the galaxy the effect was anything but silent. Fold space apertures opened in 200 systems simultaneously, stable transit points that had not existed 10 seconds earlier, each one broadcasting an open-access beacon that announced its presence to every vessel within sensor range. The beacons transmitted in every known language and included a simple message: free transit corridor, no fees, no permits, no restrictions, all species welcome. The effect was immediate and irreversible. Species that had been paying corridor access fees for centuries suddenly had a free alternative. Trade vessels that had been subject to Union checkpoint inspections could now travel between systems without passing through a single controlled point. Military supply lines that depended on corridor monopoly for strategic advantage discovered that the corridors were no longer the only option. Civilian transports that had been paying premium rates for basic interstellar travel could now move between worlds at zero cost. Within 6 hours, 83 species had begun routing their commercial traffic through our network. By hour 12, that number had doubled. By hour 20, the Union's corridor traffic had dropped by 31% and was still falling. The economic implications were staggering. Corridor fees accounted for 18% of the Union's total revenue, 18% of the budget that funded the conclave, the enforcement fleets, the regulatory apparatus, the entire machinery of galactic governance, evaporating in real time. The third wave was not a delivery or a network. It was information. At 1400 hours Coordinated Universal Time, every communication array in our network simultaneously broadcast a single data package to every species in the Union. The package contained the complete, unredacted text of the Galactic Regulatory Code, all 1.7 million statutes, annotated with Catherine Webb's analysis. The analysis was devastating, not because it was propaganda, not because it was exaggerated or distorted or spun, because it was math. Catherine had mapped every regulation to its economic impact, showing exactly which species benefited and which species paid. She had traced the flow of tariff revenue and demonstrated that 87% of all funds collected through the Union's trade system went to 7 species. 7 out of 4,000. She had identified 312 regulations that had been written specifically to suppress the economic development of particular sectors, keeping certain species dependent on imports they could have produced themselves if the rules had not prohibited it. She had calculated that the average non-ruling species paid 400% more in fees than it received in services. It was not an accusation, it was an audit. And audits are far more dangerous than accusations, because you cannot argue with arithmetic. The Union's response came faster than I expected, but slower than it needed to. The conclave convened an emergency military session and authorized enforcement action within 8 hours of our first drop. But by the time their orders reached their fleet commanders, our ships were already gone. Edward had designed the delivery protocol around a principle he called touch and vanish. Our vessels dropped cargo, transmitted data, confirmed download completion, and disappeared into our FTL network before Union patrol craft could even confirm their presence. The enforcement fleets that the conclave dispatched found empty space, confused local authorities, and populations that had already downloaded, distributed, and begun implementing everything we had sent. The Vathori sent 6 battle groups to seal the most heavily trafficked routes in our independent network. They succeeded in blocking 3 by positioning warships at the exit points and threatening to fire on any vessel that emerged. Philip opened 4 new routes within 48 hours, routing around the blockade like water flowing around stones in a riverbed. George Palmer tracked the Union's military response from the command center and gave me hourly updates. "They are chasing ghosts," he said on the second day, leaning back from the tactical display with something that was almost amusement. "Their entire doctrine is built for fleet engagements. Identify the enemy, concentrate force, engage and destroy. But we are not a fleet. We are not a target. We are not even a force in any way they understand. We are a delivery service with better engines than anything they have ever built." On the 3rd day after kindling, I received a direct communication request from Speaker Catherine. The channel was encrypted with Vathori military protocols, which meant it had been authorized at the highest level of their government. I took the call alone in my office with the door sealed. Catherine's 6 eyes filled my screen, and for the first time since the banishment vote, I saw something in them that was not contempt or indifference. It was fury. Controlled, compressed, pressurized fury. The kind that builds behind a dam until the dam breaks. "You are committing acts of war," Catherine said. "We are delivering medical supplies. You are undermining the economic stability of the Galactic Union. We are offering alternatives. Your members are free to refuse them. Do not play semantic games with me, Commander Cole. You are systematically dismantling the infrastructure of galactic governance. We are providing options. That is all we have ever done. Your members are choosing to accept those options because your system charges them more for less. That is not war, Speaker. That is competition. And the fact that you cannot tell the difference is exactly why your system is failing." Kethron's granite skin darkened, which I had learned was the Vathori equivalent of flushing with rage. His 6 eyes burned like embers in cooling stone. When he spoke again, the grinding quality of his voice had intensified until it sounded less like a person talking and more like the foundation of a building shifting. "You think you understand what you are doing. You think you are liberating species. You are not. You are creating chaos. You are dismantling 11,000 years of stability because your species is too arrogant and too impatient to exist within a system designed by civilizations older and wiser than yours." "Older, yes," I said. "Wiser? Your system charges dying species for the medicine that will save them, and calls it governance. I do not think that word means what you believe it means, Speaker. This will end with your destruction." I leaned forward until my face filled his screen, the way his filled mine. "No, Speaker, it will not. Because you cannot destroy what you cannot find. We are not in one place. We are in every place. We are in the systems your members depend on. We are in the markets your tariffs control. We are in the corridors your fleets patrol. You cannot fire on us without firing on your own people, your own infrastructure, your own economy. Every shot you take at us passes through species that depend on you for survival. And every one of those species is watching to see whether you care more about protecting them or punishing us. You banished us from your system, so we built our own, and ours is open to everyone." The connection terminated. Catherine had cut it. I sat in the silence of my office and breathed. My hands were shaking, which surprised me, because my voice had been perfectly steady. Lucy knocked on the door a few minutes later and asked if I was all right. "He threatened to destroy us," I said. "Can he?" I thought about that with the honesty the question deserved. The Vathori had the largest military fleet in the galaxy. If they committed everything, every ship, every weapon, every soldier, they could probably reduce Earth to rubble. But they could not do it quickly. They could not do it quietly. And they could not do it without revealing to 4,000 species that the Union's response to free medicine and open trade routes was genocide. No, I said, not without destroying themselves in the process. On the fourth day, the first formal defection arrived. A minor agricultural species called the Tasari, who controlled a single system with 3 habitable worlds, announced that they were suspending all tariff payments to the Union, effective immediately, and routing their entire trade operation through the human open network. The Tasari were small, politically insignificant, the kind of species that the Conclave forgot existed between votes. The Conclave barely noticed. But the Tasari were the first. And behind them, quietly, without announcements or declarations, dozens more began doing the same thing. Not leaving the Union openly, because open departure was dangerous and invited retaliation. Instead, they simply stopped participating, stopped paying fees, stopped requesting permits, stopped routing through corridors, stopped asking permission for things they no longer needed permission to do. Catherine called it the silent bleed. Species would not defect dramatically, because dramatic defection was dangerous and invited retaliation. The Union had a long history of making examples of dissenters, imposing crippling sanctions, blockading trade routes, even authorizing military action against species that challenged the system too openly. No single species wanted to be the example. But what no single species would do alone, dozens of species would do simultaneously, hidden in the crowd of each other's quiet departure. Instead, they would simply stop participating, stop paying fees, stop requesting permits, stop routing through corridors, stop asking permission for things they no longer needed permission to do. One by one, quietly, until the system that depended on universal compliance had neither the revenue nor the authority to function. The Union would not die from a single blow. It would die from 1,000 small absences, each one too minor to punish, but collectively fatal. I watched the real-time map in the command center as the numbers climbed. 12 species disconnected, 27, 41, 63, each one a bolt removed from a machine that was already groaning under its own weight. Each one a species that had looked at 2 options, the Union's expensive control and humanity's free alternative, and made the rational choice. 22 months after the banishment, Speaker Catherine stood before the conclave and told 4,000 species that the Galactic Union was under existential threat. I know this because Peter Hale's intelligence network had placed monitoring devices in the conclave chamber itself, hidden inside the atmospheric filtration system where the Vathori's security teams never thought to look. I watched the speech from the command center in real time, and for the first time since this began, I felt something close to sympathy for the man who had thrown us out. Kethran looked diminished. His granite skin had lost its polish, which in Vathori physiology indicated chronic stress. His 6 eyes moved constantly, scanning the chamber as if looking for enemies among his own members. He spoke for 40 minutes about the threat posed by human subversion, human economic disruption, human cultural infiltration. He used words like stability and order and tradition. He asked for emergency military powers. He asked for increased tariffs to fund expanded enforcement operations. He asked for loyalty. He got silence. 46 species had formally withdrawn from the conclave by that point. Another 312 had stopped paying fees while technically remaining members. The chamber that had been full to capacity on the day of our banishment now had visible gaps, empty seats where delegations had simply stopped showing up. The ones who remained sat with the careful stillness of people calculating which way to jump when the floor gives out. The defections had accelerated after a series of events that none of us had fully anticipated, but all of us had prepared for. The Rethon Collective broke first, and when they broke loudly. The Rethon controlled the Union's largest agricultural network, feeding over 200 dependent species through a distribution system that ran on Union corridors and Union tariffs. They had been one of the founding members of the Union and had sat on the governing council for 9,000 years. When the Raytheon trade minister publicly announced that the collective was switching to humanity's open trade network, citing a 60% reduction in distribution costs, the shockwave was felt on every inhabited world in the galaxy. The Union scrambled to replace the Raytheon supply chain. They could not. The infrastructure required to feed 200 species was not something that could be rebuilt in days or weeks or even months. The Raytheon had been feeding species that could not feed themselves, populations on worlds with thin atmospheres or poor soil, or limited growing seasons, species that depended entirely on imported food to survive. Without the Raytheon in the Union system, those species had two choices: go hungry, waiting for the Union to find an alternative that might never come, or accept human food synthesis technology that was already sitting in their systems, already tested, already operational, already producing food that was nutritionally equivalent to Raytheon agricultural output at a fraction of the cost. Humanity had spent months positioning that technology in exactly the systems that would be affected, anticipating this moment the way a chess player positions pieces 3 moves before the checkmate. When the Raytheon left, our systems caught the weight without a tremor. We did not plan the Raytheon defection. We planned for it. There is a difference, and the difference matters. The Ilvari Science Directorate followed 3 weeks later, and their departure carried a different kind of weight. The Ilvari had been one of Earth's most vocal critics during the banishment hearings. Their chief scientist, a researcher named Ulveth, had delivered a 40-minute testimony about the dangers of human cognitive patterns, arguing that humanity's tendency toward creative disruption was fundamentally incompatible with stable galactic governance. She had called us a species that tears down what it does not understand and calls destruction progress. Her testimony had been cited by 47 other delegations in their own statements of support for the banishment. She had, in a very real sense, provided the intellectual framework for our exile. That same Ulveth contacted us directly through a back channel that Peter's network maintained and requested a formal research partnership. The reason was a plague. A respiratory illness had swept through 3 Ilvari colony worlds, something their biologists had never encountered, a pathogen that attacked their respiratory membranes and caused progressive organ failure over a period of weeks. It was killing thousands and spreading faster than their containment protocols could manage. Their medical establishment was working around the clock, but lacked the research infrastructure to develop a treatment before the death toll became catastrophic. They had appealed to the Union for emergency research funding. The application had been submitted through proper channels, reviewed by the appropriate committees, forwarded to the relevant subcommittees, assigned a priority classification, placed in a processing queue, moved to a secondary queue when the first exceeded capacity, and then held at approval stage 19 of 27. It had been held there for 2 years. 2 years of bureaucratic procedure while Ilvari citizens suffocated in hospital wards because the rules required 27 separate approvals before emergency medical research could be funded, and approval number 19 had been blocked by a Vathori delegate who wanted concessions on an unrelated trade dispute involving mineral rights in a system 3 sectors away from Ilvari space. A trade dispute, mineral rights, while people died. When Edward's fleet delivered human-developed antiviral compounds to the affected Ilvari colonies, the plague was contained within 11 days. 11 days from delivery to containment, from the moment our ships arrived to the moment the last active case was stabilized. 2 years of asking the Union. 11 days of receiving from humanity. Ulveth sent a single message to our communication array. 11 days we were fools. The Vathori's own territories began to fracture next, and that was the wound that could not heal. 3 border colonies, systems that had been under Vathori governance for millennia, quietly opened trade channels with our merchant contacts. They did not announce it publicly. They did not formally withdraw from anything. They simply began buying human goods and selling through our network. And when Vathori inspectors arrived to investigate the anomalous trade patterns, they found local governors who looked them in the eye and said, "We are feeding our people. Arrest us if you wish." The inspectors filed their reports and returned to the Vathori homeworld with evidence that should have triggered an immediate military response. The homeworld did nothing. Arresting their own colonial governors would have required admitting publicly that Vathori territories were defying Vathori authority, and that admission would have shattered the image of monolithic Vathori unity that held the remaining Union together. So they pretended not to notice, and everyone else noticed that they were pretending, and the pretense itself became a crack that other colonies began to widen. A fourth Vathori colony opened trade channels, then a fifth, each one quietly, carefully, testing the boundaries of what the homeworld would tolerate. The answer, it turned out, was more than anyone had expected, because the alternative to tolerance was confrontation, and confrontation with their own people was the one battle the Vathori could not afford to fight. Inside the command center, the mood had shifted from desperate resolve to something more complicated. We were winning, and winning brought its own dangers. The people who had spent 2 years fighting from a position of weakness were discovering what it felt like to fight from a position of strength, and strength has a way of corrupting the judgment of even the most principled minds. Daniel Stone, one of Edward's most experienced stealth pilots, came to me after a long deployment. He had spent 3 weeks running supply missions through Vathori-controlled space, and had come back with a pilot's perspective on the situation, direct, practical, and impatient with anything that felt like unnecessary delay. "We could end this faster," he said. I looked at him carefully. Daniel was steady, competent, and not given to reckless suggestions. He had flown more insertion missions than any other pilot in the fleet, and had earned the right to be heard. How? We have better technology than they do. Better drives, better sensors, better communications. If we wanted to, we could shut down their corridor network entirely, not just offer alternatives. Remove the original. Force every species onto our network whether they want to switch or not. End this in weeks instead of months. I knew he was not alone in thinking this. I had heard the whispers in the corridors, seen the looks exchanged between operatives who had risked their lives running missions into hostile space, and who felt, understandably, that the enemy deserved more than gentle competition. I called a full meeting the next morning. Every department head, every senior operative. They filled the main briefing room, and I stood at the front and looked at their faces and saw something that frightened me more than Catherine's threats ever had. I saw hunger. The hunger to finish this. The hunger to win, not just strategically but absolutely. The hunger that every oppressed group feels when it discovers it has the power to become the oppressor. "I know what some of you are proposing," I said. "We have the capability. They deserve it. It would be faster." All of that is true, and all of that is exactly how the Vathori thought when they built the system we are trying to replace. The room went quiet. "We are not building an empire. We are building a door. Every species walks through it, or does not. That is the whole point. The moment we start forcing species through our door instead of the unions, we become exactly what we are fighting against. We become the next Catherine, standing in a chamber, deciding who is allowed to exist and who is not." 2 weeks later, someone tried to kill me. The assassination team was Vathori Special Operations, 4 agents who had infiltrated Earth's quarantine perimeter using a stolen merchant vessel and forged credentials that were good enough to fool 3 separate checkpoints. They had entered the solar system disguised as a Drenathi supply run, switched to a smaller craft in the shadow of Mars, and descended to Earth's surface using a re-entry profile that mimicked a piece of orbital debris. Professional, patient, and nearly flawless. They made it to within 3 kilometers of the Atacama facility before our ground security detected them. Helen Cross, who managed our counterintelligence operations, had installed seismic sensors across the desert that could detect footsteps at a distance of 5 kilometers. The sensors picked up 4 sets of non-human footfalls moving in formation toward the facility entrance. Helen scrambled a response team and intercepted them in a narrow canyon that served as the only surface approach to the bunker. The engagement lasted 9 minutes. The Vathori agents fought with the disciplined precision of soldiers who had trained for centuries, but our people had advantages that training could not match. We knew the terrain. We had the high ground, and we had been expecting this because Peter had warned me 6 weeks earlier that the Vathori were running covert insertion drills near the quarantine perimeter. 2 Vathori agents were killed. 2 were captured. None of our people were harmed. Helen delivered the captured agents to a holding facility inside the bunker and sent me a 1-line report that read, "Guests arrived. 2 declined to stay." I visited the captured agents in detention the next morning. They were being held in a clean room with adequate environmental controls, fed and watered and treated exactly as our protocols required. They would not speak. I did not try to make them. Instead, I sat across from them in a plain room with bare walls and no recording equipment, and told them what I was going to do. I am going to send you home. Your government sent you to kill me. I am going to put you on a ship and send you back with a full fuel load and enough supplies for the journey. And when you arrive, you will deliver a message. The senior agent, a female Vathori with a scar running across 3 of her 6 eyes, looked at me with undisguised contempt. What message? A question. If your rules were just, why do you need to kill the people who broke them? We sent them home, unharmed. Their weapons were returned, their armor was cleaned, and their ship was refueled and pointed toward Vathori space, with a clear flight path through the quarantine gaps. Peter objected on security grounds. George objected on tactical grounds. Lucy objected on the grounds that showing mercy to people who had come to kill me was precisely the kind of principled foolishness that got leaders assassinated a second time. I overruled them all. This is not about tactics, I said. This is about who we are. Every species in the galaxy is watching, even the ones who pretend they are not. They are watching to see if we are different from the Vathori or just a younger version of the same thing. They need to see that we sent the assassins home with a question instead of a bullet. That distinction is worth more than any strategic advantage we gain from keeping prisoners. 2 days after the agents were returned, the story spread. Not because we broadcast it, not because Peter planted it in any intelligence channel, because the agents themselves told it during their debriefing. The Vathori military command had interrogated them extensively, and someone inside that debriefing, someone who heard the story of being sent home alive and armed and fed, leaked the details to a civilian news network. Within a week, the question I had asked was being repeated on 40 alien broadcast channels, discussed in forums across 100 worlds, debated in academic institutions that had never shown interest in human affairs before. If their rules were just, why did they need to kill the people who broke them? The question burned across the galaxy like a signal fire, and the silence where the answer should have been was louder than anything I could have said. The Vathori tried to respond. They issued statements about security threats and destabilizing elements, and the necessity of decisive action, but none of those statements answered the question, and every species watching noticed the evasion. Lucy came into my office on a Tuesday morning and told me the conclave had called an emergency session, the first since the banishment vote. The topic was whether to revoke the banishment and invite Earth back into the Union, with full privileges restored. I read the formal invitation carefully. They wanted us back inside the system, bound by the rules, subject to the structures. They wanted to close the door we had opened and pretend the last 22 months had never happened. I set the invitation aside. We are not going back. Lucy nodded. She had already known. They are going to have to come forward. The amphitheater on Thesson Prime looked smaller than I remembered. That was not possible, of course. The structure was carved from a single piece of crystallized mineral that the Vathori had shaped over 11,000 years, and it was exactly the same size it had always been. But the last time I had stood here, it had been full. Every seat occupied, every delegation present, 4,000 species united in the singular purpose of erasing humanity from the galactic record. Now, gaps showed like missing teeth in a jaw. Empty sections where entire delegations had simply stopped existing within the Union's framework. The chamber that had once felt overwhelming now felt hollow, and the echo of my footsteps as I walked through the entrance corridor sounded different, sharper, as if the room itself knew it was emptying. I walked through that corridor flanked not by diplomats, but by representatives of a different kind of galaxy. 62 species had formally joined humanity's open network, and they had sent delegates to walk beside me, not behind me, because this was not an empire and I was not a ruler. Beside me, partners who had chosen a different system and wanted the universe to see what that choice looked like. A Drenathi trade minister walked at my left, a Rethion agricultural counselor at my right. Behind us, delegates from species I had never met before the banishment. Species who had found us through the network we had built, who had tasted freedom from tariffs and fees and regulations for the first time in their civilization's memory, and could not go back to the old way. Lucy walked just behind my right shoulder, where she had always walked since the day she joined my team 14 years ago. Catherine was behind my left, carrying a data tablet that contained the proposal we had spent 6 weeks drafting and redrafting until every word was precise. Peter, Edward, Philip, Laura, George, Helen, Daniel, and the rest of my team filled the rows behind us. They had earned this. Every one of them had spent more than 2 years building something from nothing, turning exile into an advantage and isolation into freedom, and now they were walking back into the chamber that had cast us out. Catherine stood at the speaker's podium, watching our entrance with all 6 eyes. He had aged in the way Vathori age, his granite skin developing fine cracks along the jaw and temples that indicated deep physiological strain. The crescent of his eyes had dimmed from bright amber to a dull copper. He looked like what he was, a man watching the foundations of his world crumble beneath his feet and unable to find solid ground no matter where he stepped. The chamber rustled as we entered. Species that had remained in the Union turned to watch us. Some with curiosity, craning forward in their seats. Some with resentment, arms folded, bodies angled away. Some with the barely concealed hope of people who wanted to leave but had not yet found the courage, and who were watching to see if courage was safe. I approached the podium. Catherine did not yield it, which was a power move, forcing me to speak from the floor rather than the elevated position. I had expected this. It did not matter. What I had to say would work from any height. The Galactic Union has offered to restore Earth's membership, I said, and my voice carried through the amphitheater's acoustic design, filling the space without amplification, reaching every seat in every ring. Full privileges, full access, full participation in the structures and systems of galactic governance. We have been invited to return to the fold, to resume our place within the system that expelled us 28 months ago. I paused. The silence was absolute. Even the atmospheric processors seemed to hold their breath. We decline. The rustling returned, sharper this time. Several delegations leaned forward. Whispered translations rippled through sections of the chamber. Catherine's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. He was waiting to see where this went, and I respected that about him even now. Catherine was many things, but he was not stupid. He knew that I had not come here to simply say no. We do not decline because we are angry, though we are. We do not decline because we want revenge, though there are those among us who do. We decline because the system you are offering to readmit us to is broken, and re-entering a broken system does not fix it. It just adds another passenger to a ship that is already sinking. Catherine had helped me draft this speech, but the words were mine. They had to be. This was not a legal brief or a diplomatic communique. It was a proposal for a new way of existing together across the distances between stars, and proposals like that require the weight of genuine conviction. For 28 months, humanity has operated outside your system. We have traded without tariffs. We have traveled without corridor fees. We have shared technology without licensing restrictions. We have communicated without censorship. And in 28 months of operating outside your rules, we have accomplished something that your system failed to accomplish in 11,000 years of operation. We made it possible for any species, regardless of size or wealth or military power, to access the resources they need to survive and grow. I let that settle. Numbers are more persuasive than rhetoric, and every delegation in the chamber had seen Catherine's analysis by now. They knew which species had been paying disproportionate fees. They knew which regulations existed solely to protect the economic interests of 7 ruling civilizations. They knew because we had shown them, in plain mathematics that required no interpretation and permitted no denial. Humanity does not want back into the Galactic Union. Instead, we propose something different. We propose the Galactic Accord. The chamber shifted. I could feel the change in the air, a collective intake of breath from thousands of lungs and respiratory organs, and gas exchange membranes. This was not what they had expected. They had expected demands, conditions, negotiations over the terms of re-entry. They had not expected an entirely different destination. The Accord operates on 3 principles. First, no species governs another. There is no ruling council, no speaker, no central authority that can dictate terms to anyone. Coordination happens through mutual agreement, not through hierarchy. Disputes are resolved by the parties involved, with mediation available but never mandatory. Second, all technology, resources, and knowledge are shared openly. No tariffs, no licenses, no restrictions on who can access what. Every species contributes what it can and receives what it needs. A species with advanced medical knowledge shares it with those who lack it, not as charity, but as investment. Because a galaxy of healthy civilizations produces more knowledge, more innovation, more possibilities for everyone. Third, any species can leave at any time, for any reason, without penalty, without sanctions, without threat, without being labeled a destabilizing element or a cultural contaminant. Membership is voluntary in the truest sense of the word. I paused to let the translation systems finish rendering my words into 4,000 languages. The silence that followed was not the cold silence of the banishment vote. It was a different silence. The silence of people hearing something they had wanted but never believed was possible. There is no enforcement fleet because compliance is not required. There are only agreements between equals, renegotiated freely as conditions change. Kethran finally spoke, and his grinding voice carried the authority of a being who had led the most powerful civilization in the galaxy for 4 decades. What you describe is anarchy, dressed as idealism. A galaxy without governance will descend into chaos within a generation. What you built was tyranny, dressed as order, I replied, turning to face him directly. A galaxy where 7 species write the rules and 4,000 species obey them is not governance, it is management. And the managed have decided they no longer require managers. The exchange hung in the air between us, sharp and clean and final. No one moved. The acoustic design of the chamber meant that every word had reached every seat, every ring, every delegation, still clinging to a system that was dissolving beneath them in real time. A delegate stood in the 3rd ring. I recognized the markings. Vareth, the Dranathi merchant captain who had been our first alien contact after the banishment, the one who had risked his career, his ship, and his freedom to trade with a quarantined species, because he believed that profit and principle did not have to be enemies. He looked at Kethran, then at me, then at the chamber full of species weighing their futures. The Dranathi Trading Consortium formally withdraws from the Galactic Union and requests membership in the Galactic Accord. He sat down. The simplicity of it was devastating. No speeches, no justification, just a statement and a request, delivered in a voice as calm as a morning transaction. Then, an Ilvari delegate stood, Olveth, the same scientist who had argued against humanity at the banishment hearing, and who had later begged us for plague medication. The Ilvari Science Directorate withdraws from the Union and requests Accord membership. Then the Tessari delegate. Then a species called the Morvathi, who breathed methane and had never spoken to a human before receiving our free atmospheric processing technology 6 months ago. Then the Kalani, a nomadic species whose entire civilization lived aboard a fleet of ancient generation ships, and who had been paying corridor fees that consumed 30% of their annual output just to keep moving. Then 3 more, then 5 more, then a cascade that built on itself, each departure giving courage to the next, each sentence delivered a little louder than the one before. I watched their faces as they stood. Some were afraid. I could see it in the trembling of limbs, the quick glances toward the Vathori military delegates sitting in the upper rings. They were declaring independence from the most powerful governing body in the galaxy, and some of them came from species so small that the Union could crush them without effort. But they stood anyway. They stood because the alternative was sitting in a system that charged them for their own survival and punished them for seeking something better. A species called the Vorshet, aquatic beings who communicated through vibrations in their water-filled encounter suits, stood and delivered their withdrawal in a bass tone that resonated through the floor of the chamber. The Drasani, insectoid beings who had been denied voting rights for 2,000 years because their population was deemed too small, stood and spoke in a voice that clicked and hummed with emotion that the translation systems could only partially capture. A delegation from the outer reaches, species so remote from the galactic center that most conclave members had never heard their names, stood together as a group of 11, and delivered a single combined statement. Each sentence was another fracture in a wall that had stood for 11,000 years, and the sound of that wall falling was not thunder. It was the quiet, steady rhythm of chairs pushing back and voices speaking truth. Kethran watched from the podium. His skin cracked further along the jaw, thin lines spreading like fractures in a wall bearing too much weight. He said nothing, because there was nothing to say. This was not a rebellion that could be crushed. It was a choice being made, freely, by civilizations that had finally tasted an alternative. Then the moment came that broke the Union forever, and it came not from an enemy, but from within Kethran's own house. A Vathori colonial governor named Sithara, from one of the border colonies that had been secretly trading with us for months, stood from the Vathori delegation section itself. The movement was slow, deliberate, the kind of standing up that someone does when they know that the act of rising will change everything, and they want to feel every second of it. Every eye in the chamber turned to her. Kethran turned to her. The other Vathori delegates turned to her with expressions of shock that cracked their granite composure for the first time in the entire session. The chamber went absolutely still. A Vathori breaking from the Vathori delegation was not just unexpected, it was unprecedented. In 11,000 years of conclave history, no Vathori representative had ever publicly contradicted the speaker. Their culture did not allow it. Their political system did not accommodate it. Their entire civilization was built on the assumption that the speaker spoke for all Vathori, always, without exception. Sithara spoke in the Vathori language, and the translation systems rendered her words in every tongue simultaneously. I serve the colony of Vathor Reach. For 6 months, my people have traded through the human open network. In that time, our medical outcomes have improved by 40%. Our food production has doubled. Our children are healthier, our infrastructure is stronger, our economy is growing faster than it has in 300 years of loyal union membership. She turned to Kethran, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the particular sadness of someone breaking faith with everything they had ever believed. Speaker, I have served this union faithfully for my entire career. I have enforced its rules and defended its principles, and believed in its mission. But I cannot look at the numbers from my colony, and then look at the numbers from our years under union regulation, and tell my people that the old way was better. I cannot lie to them, not anymore. She turned back to the chamber. Vathor Reach withdraws from the Galactic Union and requests Accord membership. 3 more Vathori colonies followed within minutes, then a 4th, then a 5th, each one a fracture in the body of the species that had built and ruled the galaxy for 11,000 years. The session did not end with a vote. There was no dramatic resolution, no gavel, no declaration of dissolution. The conclave simply emptied. Species stood, delivered their sentence, and walked out. Not in anger, not in triumph. In decision. They left the old system and walked toward a new one, and the walking itself was the act of revolution. I remained in the amphitheater as it emptied. Lucy stayed with me. Peter stayed too, standing near the entrance with his arms crossed, watching the departing delegations with the professional wariness of a man who had spent 2 years assuming the worst about everyone, and being proven right often enough to justify the habit. Kethran left with the 62 founding delegates, coordinating the logistics of integrating hundreds of new Accord members into a system designed from the ground up to scale without centralized control. Edward was already on his communication device, directing fleet assets to provide transit support for delegations that could no longer use Union corridors. Philip was running calculations on his tablet, determining how many new FTL routes he would need to open to handle the sudden increase in traffic. The chamber grew quiet in stages. First the voices faded, then the footsteps, then the rustle of movement, until the only sound was the low hum of the atmospheric processors and the faint click of the translation systems, powering down one by one, as they ran out of languages to translate. By the time the session was formally closed by a conclave clerk, who looked as if the ground had opened beneath his feet, fewer than 90 species remained in the Galactic Union, 90 out of 4,000, the most powerful governing body the galaxy had ever known, reduced to a remnant in a single afternoon. Kethran was the last to leave the podium. He stood there for a long time after the last defection had been announced, his 6 eyes staring out at a chamber that was nearly empty, his hands gripping the stone edges of the podium that his ancestors had carved 11 millennia ago for a purpose that no longer existed. I watched him and tried to imagine what it felt like to be the last speaker of a dead parliament, the final custodian of a system that had outlived its welcome. I could not quite manage it. The scale of what he was losing was beyond my comprehension, even as I stood in the middle of having caused it. He finally stepped down from the podium. He walked slowly, each footfall heavy with the weight of 11,000 years of authority crumbling behind him. His granite skin had cracked along both sides of his jaw and across his temples, the physiological signs of a stress so deep that his body could no longer contain it. He walked past me, and for a moment, I thought he would stop. I thought he would say something. An accusation. A curse. A threat. A confession. Something to mark the end of what his people had built and what my people had torn down. He did not stop. His 6 eyes moved over me without expression, as if I were a piece of furniture in a room he was leaving for the last time. And he continued walking, his footsteps echoing in the empty chamber, like the last beats of a heart winding down. Lucy sat in one of the empty delegate seats and looked up at the distant ceiling. Is it over? I thought about the question carefully, giving it the honesty it deserved. The union was finished, yes. The rules were burned. The system was dismantled. But the accord was just beginning. And building something new is infinitely harder than breaking something old. We had spent 28 months proving that the old way was wrong. Now we had to spend the rest of our lives proving that the new way could work. That species could cooperate without coercion, that resources could flow without gatekeepers, that freedom and order were not enemies but partners, if you trusted the people in the system to make their own choices. The fighting is over, I said. The work is just starting. She nodded. She understood. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the data chip, the one Lucy had handed me, in this same chamber, 28 months ago. The diplomatic response I had never delivered. I had carried it with me every day since the banishment, through every sleepless night in the Atacama bunker, through every operation, every crisis, every moment of doubt, every time I wondered if we were doing the right thing or just doing a different kind of wrong. I finally opened it and read the contents. Humanity respectfully requests reconsideration. I read it twice. Then I laughed. A real laugh. The kind that starts deep in the chest and fills the room and surprises even the person making it. Lucy looked at me with concern that shifted to curiosity, that shifted to a slowly spreading smile, as I turned the screen toward her. She read it and she laughed too. We sat there in the empty amphitheater of the dead Galactic Union, 2 humans laughing at a polite request that had been written for a world that no longer existed, by people who had not yet understood what they were capable of becoming. I deleted the file. The words disappeared from the screen and from existence, and I felt lighter for their absence. We had not requested reconsideration. We had not begged, or bargained, or bent. We had done something far more radical than protesting the rules. We had made the rules unnecessary, and in doing so, we had given 4,000 species something that no amount of regulation or governance or enforcement could ever provide, the right to choose for themselves. I stood, offered Lucy my hand, and together we walked out of the chamber and into a galaxy that no longer needed permission to exist. Peter fell into step behind us, and as we passed through the entrance corridor, I heard his footsteps join ours, and then other footsteps, the delegates from our 62 partner species who had been waiting outside, falling in beside us, behind us, around us, a growing sound of movement that filled the corridor like a river finding its course. Behind us, the lights of the amphitheater dimmed one section at a time, shutting down in sequence as the automated systems detected that the space was no longer in use. Ring by ring, the crystallized walls faded from their ambient glow into darkness, each section going dark with a soft click that echoed in the emptying space. 11,000 years of governance, ending not with an explosion or a surrender, but with an empty room and the methodical shutdown of systems that no longer had anyone to serve. Ahead of us, through the corridor, and past the transit hub, and beyond the atmosphere of Thesson Prime, the galaxy waited, 4,000 species waking up in a universe without rulers for the first time in 11 millennia. I did not pretend that what came next would be easy. Some species would struggle without the structure they had depended on for centuries. Some would test the limits of freedom and find that freedom without responsibility was just another form of chaos. Some would fail and need help, and have to learn the difficult lesson that asking for help from equals is different from receiving it from masters. There would be disputes and disagreements, and moments when the entire accord seemed like it might unravel before it had properly begun. But none of that changed the fundamental truth at the center of everything we had built. Every single species in the galaxy would navigate those challenges freely, choosing for themselves, building at their own pace, trading on their own terms, asking their own questions, without fear of being quarantined for the answers. They would make their own mistakes and find their own solutions, and build their own futures, without anyone standing above them deciding what they were and were not allowed to become. That was enough. That was everything. The rule book was ash, and from the ash, something better was already growing.